Welcome to another installment of Podell's Screencasts. Let's get after it. Today we're going to be discussing the philosophical underpinnings of the American governmental system. You have to remember that prior to the foundation of the United States, the prevailing wisdom in the world with regard to the legitimate flow of political power was this notion of the divine right of kings, that there were some people who were chosen by a deity to rule over others. Some of us were born to give orders, others of us were meant to obey them. Political power flowed in a very top-down manner. Then along come people like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, other philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, that posit an entirely different theory about the legitimate exercise or flow, frankly, of political power, that these things come from the people, that we are all born inherently with limitless sovereignty, and that we in turn loan some, though not all of it, to a government to act in our stead and effectuate our best interests. That government is only legitimate when it governs in our name and derives its political power from our consent. And so after the American Revolution, in Yorktown, Pennsylvania, a group of delegates from the various now newly liberated countries from the Crown of Great Britain determined to create the Articles of Confederation, a loose league of friendship between the 13 newly independent countries, and they must be looked at that way in order to understand the difference in position between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which we'll get to in a moment, concerning the American Constitution. These 13 countries create this loose league of friendship, a unicameral legislature that has no ability to tax the citizens, has no executive branch to enforce its dictums, no judicial branch to mediate disputes and interpret law between the states and the people amongst those countries. And so what's left with is a really weak, ineffectual system that's hamstrung from the beginning. And so, as the story goes, a group of really enlightened people gather in Philadelphia and decide that they are going to first amend the Articles of Confederation, but the motion is adopted immediately to blow the whole thing up and start over. Part of James Madison's Virginia Plan, which we'll get to in a moment. And so what's created are two factions of people, people who are for ratification of the new document, who we call Federalists, who believe that the federal government needs to be greatly strengthened, and people who are against ratification of the new document, who believe in the sovereignty of the 13 countries rather than the creation of one. We call those anti-federalists. At this convention, as I just mentioned, there's a plan called the Virginia Plan that's advanced by James Madison. Larger states tended to like this. It called for bicameral legislature in the new government, representation apportioned by population, with a strong national government, had facets like a veto over state actions that didn't make it into the new Constitution. In rebuttal, the small states put forth what's called the New Jersey Plan, or the small state plan, that called for a unicameral legislature that only would be apportioned by statehood. So each state would have one individual vote. The amalgamation of these two plans and other motions representing the eventual compromise that we would come to know as the Constitution of the United States. So the question then must be raised, how do you sell this new Constitution if you believe that legitimacy can only be conferred by the people legitimately loaning their political power to the government? How do you sell the public on ratifying this document? And what comes from that are the Federalist Papers produced by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison that sell the Constitution to the American public. One of the key concepts embodied in the new Constitution that the authors of the Federalist Papers consistently refer to as a chief selling point is the notion of federalism. It's this idea, federalism, that power is shared between the federal government or national government and the state governments, who, remember, came first. They were the first legitimate political authority recognized by the citizens of what becomes the United States of America. And so, what the Constitution really represents is the state governments losing some degree of their authority in order to correct that imbalance that we noted earlier. Now, there are some powers expressly reserved by the states themselves that you can see here that the federal government cannot touch. There are other powers that are delegated to the federal government that are beyond the reach of any of the state governments. Those are their exclusive prerogatives. And then there are some areas called concurrent powers, the middle of this Venn diagram, that overlap. The federal government's word is supreme or supersedes the words of the states here, but they do technically share the obligation. The other concept that the three Federalists who wrote the Federalist Papers used to sell the Constitution to the United States citizens and allay the concerns of some of the anti-federalists who were afraid that the new federal government would have too much power is the notion of separation of powers. It's a concept that comes mostly from the French philosophers in the Enlightenment, though you do find it amongst the British as well. It's this notion that the federal government chiefly has three powers: to write law, to enforce law, and to interpret and apply law in the mediation of disputes. And so what you find here is the legislature, embodied within the bicameral legislature, is given the authority to write the law and initiate the process of writing the law. The executive exercises a veto over the legislature as a check upon it, and is charged expressly with enforcing the law. And the judiciary serves as the interpreter, the final arbiter of what it is that the law and Constitution actually say. We will get more into these three powers of the federal government as the year goes on, and we examine each of these three branches in greater detail.